Friends, glad to see you on the channel. Today I'll tell you the story of how a country that didn't have a single tank and nearly disappeared from the world map transformed in 72 years into one of the largest tank exporters on the planet. Why did Poland buy almost 1,000 of these machines for $15 billion instead of going to the Americans with Abrams or the Germans with Leopards? How did a small Asian country, which 70 years ago was barely saved from destruction, managed to create a tank that Europe buys today? And at the end, I'll tell you about one technology installed on the Black Panther that makes enemy tanks burn by hitting them in their most vulnerable spot. June 25, 1950, early morning on the Korean peninsula. At 5 a.m., artillery preparation began all along the 38th parallel. An hour after the bombardment started, troops of the Korean People's Army crossed the border. Leading the advance were hundreds of Soviet T-34-85 tanks, legendary machines that had crushed the tank divisions of the Third Reich at Kursk just a few years earlier. South Korea had not a single tank, literally not one. The Republic of Korea Army consisted mainly of infantry units armed with light small arms. Against the armored avalanche from the north, South Korean soldiers were completely helpless, and tanks were what decided the outcome of battles in modern warfare. In the first 3 days of war, North Korean tank columns broke through all defense lines. Steel monsters with 85mm guns simply crushed the enemy's defense. South Korean soldiers fired at them with rifles and machine guns. Bullets bounced off the armor like peas off a wall. June 28, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, fell after just 3 days of fighting. The government fled south. Hundreds of thousands of civilians panicked and left their homes. The country stood on the brink of complete annihilation. The United Nations decided to send international forces. The United States urgently began transferring troops from bases in Japan. M24 Chaffee light tanks were sent to Korea. These machines were developed during World War II as light reconnaissance tanks. The Chaffee weighed 18 tons and was armed with a 75mm gun. American military officials understood perfectly well that the Chaffee had no chance in a direct confrontation with the T-34-85. July 10, 1950, the first tank battle of the Korean War occurred. Company A from the 78th Tank Battalion USA met a column of North Korean T-34s. American tankers opened fire first. The 75mm shells hit the armor of Soviet tanks and bounced off. North Korean tankers returned fire. The 85mm shells penetrated the thin armor of the Chaffee completely. In a few minutes of battle, 2 M24s were destroyed. By the end of July, of 14 Chafees, only 2 remained operational. From July 1, 1950 to October 6, 1951, the Americans lost 195 millions 24 tanks. UN forces were pushed back to a tiny beachhead around the city of Busan on the southern coast. All of South Korea had shrunk to the size of one province. Only the amphibious operation at Incheon in September, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, turned the tide of war. But the war turned into a bloody positional slaughter that continued for another 3 years. July 27, 1953, in the village of Panmunjom, both sides signed an armistice agreement. This was not a peace treaty, but only an armistice. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea formally remain at war to this day. South Korea drew traumatic experience from this war. A country that was nearly wiped off the map due to lack of its own tanks made an oath to itself, never again will this happen. But in the 50s and 60s, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. Per capita income was lower than in many African states. Producing their own tanks was out of the question. The only option was to rely on American military aid. The South Korean Army received what the United States considered obsolete for its own needs: decommissioned tanks, worn-out equipment. Koreans drove on handouts from their benefactors. American M48 Patton tanks arrived after being decommissioned. These machines were developed in the late 40s. By the 60s, they were already morally obsolete. But for South Korea, this was better than nothing. Meanwhile, the situation in the north was changing. The DPRK, with Soviet Union support, was building military power. While South Korea received scraps, the north armed itself with the latest technology, early 1970s. Office of South Korean President Park Chung-hee. On the desk lies a secret report from the National Intelligence Service. According to agent data, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea launched its own tank factory. Licensed production of Soviet T-62 tanks had begun. This tank represented a serious threat. Its 115mm smoothbore gun penetrated the armor of practically any Western tank of that era. The balance of power on the peninsula was rapidly changing. Information about the North Korean tank factory coincided with an event that overturned South Korea's entire defense strategy. July 25, 1969, President Richard Nixon gave a speech on Guam Island. He announced a new foreign policy doctrine that entered history as the Nixon Doctrine. Its essence was simple: the United States will continue to help its partners economically and with military equipment, but Americans will no longer take on the entire burden of defense. Local countries must defend themselves. The American military contingent will be gradually reduced. The defenders were leaving. Try to imagine such a situation. You live in a house. Behind the wall is your neighbor. Every day he comes out into the yard and sharpens a large axe. Looks in your direction with undisguised hatred. Between the plots is only a low fence. But nearby lives a strong friend who is always ready to help. And now this friend announces he's moving away. You remain alone with your neighbor and his axe. President Park Chung-hee immediately began negotiations. South Korea needed modern tanks, American M60A1S. These machines formed the backbone of NATO tank forces in Europe. A South Korean delegation went to Washington with a request to purchase several hundred tanks, but Washington refused time and again. Limited production capacity, priority provision for their own troops. The Americans could not or would not sell a sufficient number of modern tanks. President Park Chung-hee finally understood the main thing. Relying only on American aid was a dead end. The only reliable solution was their own defense industry, an industry capable of producing modern tanks without looking back at foreign partners. The problem was that South Korea had no experience. There were no factories, no engineers, no technologies. They needed to start from absolute zero. The Americans agreed to limited assistance. A group of South Korean engineers was sent to the Armored Vehicle Repair Center in Alabama. Koreans studied the casting of armored plates, mastered mechanical metal processing, learned welding, comprehended assembly of units. This was only the first step. Satellite images confirmed the fear. The tank factory in the DPRK was working at full capacity. Columns of brand new T-62s were rolling out the gates. The North's military advantage was growing. South Korea could not create a modern tank from scratch in a short time. The only way was licensed production. Negotiations with American companies began. The basis would be M1 Abrams technologies, but adapted to Korean conditions. Thus the K1 project was born. In the 80s, K1 tanks began entering the army. It seemed the goal was achieved, but a new problem arose. The K1 was based on American technologies. Every part was under export control. South Koreans could not freely dispose of their own development. Any export required coordination with the Americans, but during these years an economic miracle occurred in South Korea. Samsung, Hyundai, LG. Korean ships sailed all oceans. From a poor country, South Korea turned into an industrial giant. By the mid-90s, the economy stabilized. Money appeared, technologies appeared, ambitions appeared, and South Korea returned to its dream, the dream of complete defense independence. The Defense Development Agency received a task of state importance: create a new generation main battle tank using exclusively their own technologies. No American restrictions, no dependency, only Korean development. The approach had to be completely different from the K1 development. Instead of relying on one foreign partner, the Koreans decided to gather the best knowledge from around the world, create a dream team of the world's best experts. South Korea sent invitations to leading specialists. Experts from Sweden with experience working on the STAR-V-103 responded, French engineers who created the Leclerc, Israeli specialists who knew the Merkava, British designers who designed the Challenger. Each conducted a series of intensive 40-hour seminars. Foreign experts shared experience, talked about problems during development, explained which solutions proved successful. All presentations were recorded and archived. A priceless knowledge base was being created. 7 top researchers were sent for a year-long internship in Great Britain. There they studied the latest achievements in tank construction, worked in design bureaus. After returning, these engineers became the backbone of the design team. Work officially began in 1995. The budget was $230 million. Development timeline. 11 years. Goal: create a tank equal to or surpassing the best NATO machines. The result was to be the Black Panther, a tank that would combine the best features of the Leclerc and Leopard 2 with complete technological independence. The name was not chosen by chance. Tactical doctrine assumed the tank would be fast, like a panther, in Korea's mountainous forests. Speed was to make it deadly, like a predator. And let's be honest, Black Panther sounded better than Tank Number 2. Responsibility was placed on Hyundai Rotem. Partners were Samsung, Techwin and Kia, a consortium of Korea's largest industrial enterprises. Samsung was responsible for electronics, Kia for transmission components. Hyundai coordinated and carried out assembly. From July 1995 to December 1997, research was conducted, world experience was analyzed. They determined which technologies to develop from scratch. Development began in 1998. From 2003 to 2007, 5 prototypes were built. Each tested different technologies. MTR checked mobility, FTR firepower. 3 PV prototypes underwent comprehensive testing. March 2007, proving ground in Changwon. The final prototype rolled onto the platform. The president personally attended. The defense minister gave a speech about the project's importance. The K2 Black Panther tank was presented to the world. September 2008. DAPA, after testing, recognized the K2 as combat-ready. The project cost 452.6 billion won. 14 years of work were crowned with success, but the path to serial production proved difficult. In March 2011, DAPA announced a postponement. Problems arose with the domestic engine and transmission. In April 2012, a decision was made: the first 100 tanks would receive German MTU powerplants. Work on the domestic engine would continue in parallel. June 2014. The first K2 Black Panthers were adopted into service. The dream of their own tank came true. The Black Panther's main weapon is a 120mm smoothbore L-55 gun, a Korean version of the German Rheinmetall gun. Barrel length 6.6 meters. This is 130 centimeters longer than the L-44 gun installed on Abrams and older Leopards. What does this mean in practice? A longer barrel creates higher pressure when firing. The shell accelerates to greater speed. Result: significantly better armor penetration of the enemy. Initial shell velocity, 1,400 meters per second versus 1,140 on the K101. Korean designers developed their own automatic loading system. It's compatible with all standard NATO shells. Shells are fed from the rear of the turret by a mechanism similar to a machine gun belt. The system works even while moving over rough terrain. Rate of fire from 10 to 15 shots per minute during continuous fire. Thanks to the autoloader, the crew was reduced to 3 people: commander, gunner, driver, mechanic. A 4th crew member is no longer needed. In a critical situation, the tank can be controlled by even 2 people, and in an extreme case, by 1. The daytime fire control system is from French company Relied. Technology is proven on the curve. A high degree of automation allows even inexperienced conscripts to quickly master complex systems. After target acquisition, the gun and turret automatically track the object. The crew doesn't need to constantly intervene. The Korean engine is slightly inferior to the German in acceleration. From 0 to 32 km per hour takes almost 8 seconds versus 7 for the original. But operational parameters are impressive. Maximum speed 70 km per hour. Range 430 km. The 1,500 horsepower engine pulls 55 tons. The first series of 100 units received German engines. All subsequent batches come out with fully Korean power plants. Armor is the strictest military secret. A composite mixture of ceramics and other materials, developed by Samsung, probably inspired by British Chobham armor from Challenger tanks. The front withstood a direct hit from an anti-tank shell fired from its own L-55 gun at close range. The ammunition compartment is equipped with special panels. During an explosion, they direct the force outward, protecting the crew. This eliminates the turret toss effect that became a tragic symbol of Russian tanks in Ukraine. Revolutionary suspension system. A hybrid scheme combines hydrop pneumatic elements with torsion bars located alternately between the wheels. Unique capability: the tank can lower and raise the entire hull, like a lowrider on American streets. In Korea's mountainous terrain, this has combat application. The tank literally squats behind an elevation, minimizing its silhouette, then raises the gun at a steep angle, like a mortar. Specifically for this capability, an innovative shell was created, Korean's smart top-attack munition castam. It has its own guidance system, 4 stabilizers. How does it work? After firing, the shell finds the target. In the final phase, it deploys a parachute that slows the fall. Then it strikes the thin top armor of the enemy tank with a jet of molten metal. When the crew of a Black Panther says they'll bring down fire rain from the sky, the enemy should take these words absolutely seriously. The ammunition load is 40 shells. 16 are in the autoloader, the rest in the hull. In addition to smart castam shells, the tank uses K279 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot and K280 multi-purpose rounds. Auxiliary armament includes a K6 heavy machine gun of 12.7 mm caliber on the commander's turret, a coaxial 7.62 mm machine gun. Smoke grenade launchers are installed on the sides of the turret to create interference. The tank is equipped with advanced threat detection systems. 4 laser sensors detect illumination by enemy sights. Millimeter wave radar detects approaching missiles. The system automatically alerts the crew and fires smoke grenades in the right direction. The tank's dimensions are dictated by Korean conditions. Combat weight 55 tons, hull length 7.5 meters, with gun forward 10.8 meters, width 3.6 meters, height 2.2 meters, which is 19 centimeters lower than the Abrams. A low silhouette is critically important for Korea. Mountainous terrain requires compact machines capable of hiding behind terrain folds. Every centimeter of height can mean the difference between detection and camouflage. The tank can overcome water obstacles up to 5 meters deep. For this, a special tube is installed on the commander's hatch. It serves for air supply and emergency evacuation. Underwater driving is critically important for a peninsula surrounded by water. The C4I system integrates the tank into a unified network. Command, control, communications, computers, intelligence. The Black Panther exchanges data with other tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, aviation. All information about the battlefield is available to the crew in real time. A built-in self-diagnostic system checks all tank functions without external equipment. The crew sees the status of each system on their displays. Problems are identified before they lead to breakdowns. The cost of one K2 tank for the domestic market was $8.5 million in 2014. One of the most expensive tanks in the world. But the Black Panther was created not only for the domestic market. South Korea planned exports from the very beginning. The tank was developed on their own technologies. No American restrictions. They can sell to anyone. A combination of advanced technologies, complete production independence, and willingness to transfer knowledge. That's what distinguished the Korean offer from Western competitors. And this is exactly what convinced Poland to make a historic decision. July 2022. Warsaw and Seoul signed a framework agreement on the supply of military equipment. The package included K2 tanks, K9 self-propelled artillery, FA-50 attack aircraft, but tanks became the jewel of the contract. What did South Korea offer? Not just ready-made tanks, a full license to produce their own Polish version K2PL, technology transfer, construction of production on Polish soil. None of the Western manufacturers are ready to share secrets to such an extent. Americans surround Abrams with dozens of export restrictions. Germans drag on for years with decisions on Leopard deliveries. The Koreans delivered the first batch in 5 months. December 15, 2022. Port of Gdynia, northern Poland, Baltic Sea coast. On the pier, Polish President Andrzej Duda, surrounded by top generals and ministers. Everyone is watching a huge transport ship. The first tanks purchased from South Korea roll off it. 180 combat vehicles with a total cost of over $1 billion. They signed the contract 5 months ago, and the tanks are already on Polish soil. The fastest implementation of a heavy weapons contract in the history of the global arms market. Not a single Western manufacturer could have delivered even half this quantity in such a time frame. August 2025. An executive contract was signed for the delivery of another 180 K2s, cost $6.7 billion. Of these, 64 machines in K2PL configuration, adapted to Polish needs. Key element, technology transfer and start of production in Poland. At the Bumar-Labady factory, they will build 61 of the 64 K2 PLs. Poland is not just buying tanks, it's receiving technologies. With a total order reaching almost 1,000 machines, the total cost is about $15 billion. Poland is becoming one of Europe's largest tank powers, equipped with tanks that until recently seemed like technological fantasy. For South Korea, this is a symbolic triumph. 72 years ago, the country had not a single tank, nearly lost a war because of it. A decade of humiliation from American handouts, years of learning and copying. Today they export 1,000 tanks to a European NATO country. From student they became teacher. From aid recipient they transformed into weapons supplier. From copying technology they moved to creating their own, from dependency to independence. Other countries have shown interest too. Norway ordered the K2 no version. Peru is considering purchases and licensed production. Turkey received technologies for its Alte tank based on the K2. South Korea became an exporter of tank technologies. The speed of development is astounding, from complete zero to export giant in 70 years. A country without natural resources, without tank building experience, without a technological base, but with will, persistence, and investments in education was able to reach incredible heights. When a Black Panther crew rolls onto the battlefield, they carry not just 55 tons of steel and electronics, they carry the history of a country that refused to remain a victim and became the creator of its own destiny, a history that began with the catastrophe of June 25, 1950, and led to triumph at the port of Gdynia 72 years later. And that technology I promised to tell you about at the beginning, the smart Castam shell that fires along a ballistic trajectory, deploys a parachute, and attacks enemy tanks from above in their most vulnerable spot. It's precisely this development that makes the Black Panther unique among all modern tanks in the world. If you like this story, give it a like. Write in the comments what you think about South Korean tank construction. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories about the most amazing military technology of modernity.